The Silk Road influenced Western ideas and philosophies. Tonight, you will find yourself in another place, another time. The air is softer here. The pace is slower. And the world moves without urgency, without noise, without interruption. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. You can simply observe and let each moment pass as gently as it arrives. If you find this kind of quiet storytelling helpful, please subscribe and return whenever you need a moment of rest. You can always try one of the other videos. If you'd like the story to continue while you sleep, you can set the video to loop. Now, take a slow breath and let the world around you begin to fade as you drift into the quiet rhythm of history. Close your eyes and picture a merchant sitting at the edge of a fire somewhere in the Tarim Basin in the year 200 AD, with the wind pressing against the walls of the caravanserai and the camels folded asleep in the courtyard outside. He is a Sogdian from the great city of Samarkand, and he has been on the road for 4 months. Beside him sits a Buddhist monk from the Kushan Empire, that great civilization stretching across what is now Afghanistan and northern India, who has been walking west for 2 years, carrying a scroll of sacred texts in a fabric case strapped carefully to his back. They share a fire and a meal in whatever language they have in common, which is probably a handful of Sogdian, a handful of Gandhari, and a great deal of gesture and patience. And in the space of that conversation, something moves. An idea crosses for 2 years, carrying a scroll of sacred texts in a fabric case strapped carefully to his back. They share a fire and a meal in whatever language they have in common, which is probably a handful of Sogdian, a handful of Gandhari, and a great deal of gesture and patience. And in the space of that conversation, something moves. An idea crosses a border it has never crossed before. A story gets told in a way neither man has told it before, to an audience unlike any either has addressed. And the world is, in a way too small to measure that evening, but too large to ignore across the centuries, genuinely different by morning. This is what the Silk Road actually was, beneath the silk, and the spices and the bolts of fabric and the compressed bricks of tea. It was a conversation that never entirely stopped, conducted in dozens of languages around hundreds of fires across 4,000 miles of some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth for over 1,500 years. Before we go any further, get yourself settled. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And wherever in the world you are right now, please drop me a comment with your location and the time. I love those notes enormously, and I read every single one. Now is the time to dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We have spent 2 previous evenings on this road, following silk from Empress Lizu's teacup across the world's markets, and following tea from Chinese mountain gardens over the Pamir Mountains to the teacups of England. Tonight we follow something that has no weight and takes up no space in a camel's panniers, and yet traveled the road more completely and more permanently than any physical commodity. Tonight we follow ideas. The Silk Road's name was invented by a German geographer in 1877. Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen, who coined the German term Seidenstrasse in a geological survey of China, intending it to describe the specific commercial routes of the Han Dynasty period. The name stuck because it captured something real about the routes. They were defined above all by the movement of high-value, low-weight goods across great distances, and silk was the most iconic of these. What the name does not capture is the much larger truth that every camel loaded with silk was also carrying, in the minds and hearts of the people guiding it, a set of beliefs about the universe, a language, a musical tradition, a mathematical system, a way of understanding what gods were and what they wanted, a set of stories about where the world came from and where it was going. The Silk Road did not transport ideas the way it transported silk, in bales, wrapped in oilcloth, tied to a pack frame. Ideas traveled in people. They traveled in the heads of monks and merchants and musicians and diplomats and the occasional prisoner of war who found themselves, through circumstances they had not chosen, moving along the routes from one world into another. They traveled slowly, accumulated, changed shape as they crossed borders, acquired local colors and modifications, and arrived at their destinations transformed in ways that their originators would not have entirely recognized. But they arrived, and what they built at the western end of the road, in the great cities of Persia and Byzantium, in the libraries of Baghdad, in the monasteries of medieval Europe, was a substantial fraction of the intellectual world that we still inhabit today. The religion that most of Europe practices, the numeral system that everyone on Earth uses to do arithmetic, the philosophical tradition that underlies Western science, the very words embedded in the English language, algorithm, algebra, sugar, lemon, admiral, saffron. All of these carry within them the traces of ideas that moved west along the same road that carried silk and tea and the compressed secrets of a Chinese silkworm. The word algorithm, which describes the step-by-step procedures that underlie all of modern computing and artificial intelligence, is a corruption of the name of a 9th century Islamic mathematician named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, who worked at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a city that sat at the western terminus of the Silk Road's Central Asian branches and received the intellectual output of civilizations stretching from China to Greece. The word algebra comes from the title of his most famous book, The Numbers You Use to Count With. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0 are called Arabic numerals in English, but they originated in India and traveled west along the same trade routes that carried cotton and pepper and Buddhist manuscripts. This is the story of how a trade route changed what Western civilization thinks, what it believes, how it counts, how it understands the relationship between light and darkness, good and evil, the nature of the divine, and the structure of the physical world. It is a story with no single hero and no single moment of revelation. It is a story made of thousands of conversations beside thousands of fires, each one adding a small amendment to the shared human record of what we know and what we believe and what we pass on. It begins, as so many things do, with the movement of armies. Before the Silk Road existed as a commercial network, before the first bolt of Chinese silk had been loaded onto the first Bactrian camel heading west, a young Macedonian general had already done something that would shape the intellectual history of everything that followed. Alexander the Great's military campaigns from 334 to 323 BC carried Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek art, and Greek ideas about the structure of the universe across a territory stretching from the eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Indus River Valley in what is now Pakistan. He founded cities along the way, more than 20 of them, many called Alexandria, and installed Greek-speaking administrators, soldiers, and merchants who stayed after the armies had moved on, creating islands of Hellenistic culture embedded in the body of Asian civilization like seeds pressed into soil. The intellectual consequence of this was extraordinary and took centuries to fully unfold. Greek philosophy, the tradition that runs from Pythagoras through Socrates and Plato to Aristotle, carried within it a specific and radical idea about how knowledge works. That the universe is ordered by rational principles that human minds can discover through systematic observation and logical reasoning, and that this discovery process is not the exclusive property of priests or kings, but is available to anyone with the patience and the training to pursue it. This idea was not universal in the ancient world. Many civilizations organized their understanding of reality around revelation, tradition, and the authority of sacred texts rather than independent rational inquiry. The Greek philosophical tradition's insistence on reason as the primary tool of knowledge was, in the context of the ancient world, genuinely unusual. When Alexander's successors, the Seleucids in Persia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in Central Asia, maintained the Greek intellectual tradition in their courts, they created a network of institutions through which Greek philosophical texts circulated across a huge territory. The Great Library of Alexandria, established under the Ptolemies in the 3rd century BC, was the most ambitious attempt in the ancient world to collect the sum of human knowledge in one place. And it collected not only Greek texts, but documents from Egyptian, Persian, Indian, and Babylonian traditions. The library was a Silk Road institution before the Silk Road formally existed, a node where intellectual currents from multiple civilizations met and mixed. By the time the Han Dynasty opened the formal Silk Road routes in 130 BC through Zhang Qian's pioneering missions, the groundwork of Hellenistic culture was already embedded across the western end of the route. The Parthian Empire that controlled the territory between Rome and China. Those enormously profitable middlemen who added their markup to every bolt of silk moving westward, was deeply Hellenized at its elite levels, with Greek as one of its administrative languages and Greek philosophical thought integrated into its intellectual culture. The Kushan Empire that flourished in Central Asia and northwestern India from roughly the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD synthesized Greek, Iranian, and Indian cultural elements in a way that produced some of the most distinctive art and philosophy of the ancient world. The very first images of the Buddha in human form, rather than the earlier tradition of representing the Buddha through symbols like footprints or an empty throne, were made in the Gandharan workshops of the Kushan Empire, and they show clear Greek stylistic influence. The Buddha's hair rendered in Greek waves, his robes draped in the manner of Greek sculpture, his face carrying the calm, idealized beauty of Hellenistic portraiture. This fusion, the image of the Buddha rendered in the artistic vocabulary of Greek sculpture, is one of the most visually striking examples of Silk Road cultural synthesis, and it is also a reminder of how thoroughly the road mixed things up in ways that nobody had planned or predicted. A Greek artistic tradition that originated in the workshops of classical Athens traveled east with Alexander's armies, settled into the workshops of Gandhara, and was then applied to the representation of a religious figure from the Indian spiritual tradition, producing images that would travel further east along the Silk Road into China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, shaping the visual vocabulary of Buddhist art across all of East Asia for 2,000 years. The Buddha statues in Japanese temples look the way they do partly because Greek sculptors once made statues of Apollo. Historians still argue whether Alexander himself intended any of this intellectual legacy, whether his campaigns were driven by a genuine philosophical vision of cultural synthesis, as some ancient sources suggest, or whether the cultural mixing that followed was simply an unintended byproduct of military conquest, as more skeptical historians maintain. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The Greek intellectual tradition was embedded across an enormous stretch of the eventual Silk Road corridor, creating the conceptual infrastructure that would allow ideas to travel along the route in both directions for the next 15 centuries. The Sogdians, those brilliant, commercially minded people from the region of Samarkand who dominated Silk Road trade from roughly the 4th to the 8th centuries AD, were heirs to this Hellenistic heritage and added their own specific contributions to the intellectual mixing of the road. They spoke an Iranian language related to Persian, but their culture had absorbed Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian elements into something distinctive and genuinely cosmopolitan. Sogdian merchants who operated trading networks stretching from China to the Mediterranean were not simply moving goods. They were operating information networks, carrying letters, actual physical letters, some of which survive in remarkable condition from a cache discovered in a watchtower on the Hexi corridor that discussed commercial transactions, but also political events, religious developments, and cultural observations about the places they passed through. The Sogdian language became the lingua franca of the Central Asian Silk Road, the practical language of commerce and communication that allowed a Chinese merchant and a Persian diplomat to conduct business, and it carried embedded within its commercial vocabulary a whole world of shared cultural reference. These merchants who moved silk and tea and spices were simultaneously moving something much harder to weigh and much more durable than any physical commodity. They were moving the assumption, held across the entire breadth of the Silk Road network, that different civilizations had things to learn from each other, that the ideas of one culture were not automatically invalidated by the fact that they originated in a foreign place, but might, on the contrary, become more powerful when combined with the ideas of another. This assumption was not universally held in the ancient world, and it is not universally held today. But it was the working assumption of the Silk Road at its best, and the consequences of that assumption for the history of human knowledge were staggering. We are about to follow the most consequential of those consequences. The spread of a religion that began in a garden in northern India, traveled the most difficult roads in the world, and changed the inner life of half the planet. Sometime in the 5th century BC, in the foothills of what is now Nepal, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath a fig tree and experienced something that he subsequently spent the remaining decades of his life trying to put into words. The experience is called enlightenment in English, a translation of the Sanskrit bodhi, which means awakening. And what the prince reported having awakened to was a set of insights about the nature of suffering, the causes of suffering, and the possibility of liberation from suffering through a specific program of mental and ethical discipline. The religion that grew from these insights, Buddhism, is today practiced by approximately 500 million people across the globe. The vast majority of them live in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And the reason Buddhism exists in East Asia at all is the Silk Road. The transmission of Buddhism from its Indian homeland to China, Korea, Japan, and the rest of East Asia is one of the most consequential intellectual and spiritual migrations in human history, and it happened almost entirely through the movement of people along the trade routes. The first Buddhist missionaries who traveled into Central Asia in the centuries after the Buddha's death were not state-sponsored ambassadors or official emissaries. They were monks, individual practitioners following a tradition that explicitly valued wandering, that organized its relationship to the wider society around the movement of teachers and the collection of lay support, and that had theological reasons of its own to spread. The Mahayana form of Buddhism that became dominant along the Silk Road taught that bodhisattvas, beings who have achieved enlightenment but delay their final release from the cycle of rebirth in order to help all other beings reach liberation, were available as objects of devotion and supplication for ordinary people. This was a powerfully democratic spiritual proposition, and it traveled well. Buddhist monasteries began appearing along the Silk Road routes through Central Asia from roughly the 1st century BC onward. These monasteries served a function that was simultaneously religious and deeply practical. They were rest stops. A monastery in an oasis town on the edge of the Tarim Basin provided shelter, food, water, and a measure of security to travelers of any religious background. The monastic tradition's ethic of hospitality was not conditional on conversion. Merchants who stopped at a Buddhist monastery for a few days while their camels rested would hear teachings, observe rituals, encounter the art and texts that adorned the monastery's walls and libraries, and carry away whatever impression those encounters had made. Some became committed converts. Many more simply carried a partial, second-hand version of Buddhist ideas further down the road, where those ideas encountered other ideas and combined with them in unpredictable ways. The physical route that Buddhism traveled into China followed the Silk Road so precisely that the correspondence is almost architectural. Buddhism entered China through the Tarim Basin, through the oasis kingdoms of Khotan, Kashgar, Kucha, and Dunhuang, which were the same staging posts where silk merchants rested their camels and repacked their loads. The first Buddhist texts in China were translated at Luoyang, the eastern terminus of the main Silk Road routes, in the 2nd century AD. The first Buddhist communities documented in China appear at the courts of Han princes in the same period, and the tradition describes these communities as containing foreign monks alongside Chinese converts. Parthian, Kushan, Sogdian, and Indian practitioners who had traveled east along the road and stayed. The most famous translator of early Buddhist texts into Chinese was a man named Kumarajiva, born around 344 AD in Kucha, one of the great Buddhist oasis kingdoms on the northern branch of the Silk Road, to an Indian father and a Kuchian princess mother. He studied in Kashmir and Kashgar, mastered both Sanskrit and Chinese, and eventually produced translations of Buddhist scriptures that are still used today by Chinese-speaking Buddhist communities around the world, their literary quality so high that they shaped the development of the Chinese written language itself. Kumarajiva is a small category of person, the translator who is also a literary artist, whose work creates rather than simply conveys, whose versions of texts become more influential than the originals. His Chinese Buddhism is, in a very real sense, an intellectual creation of the Silk Road, the offspring of Indian philosophical sophistication, Central Asian monastic culture, and Chinese literary tradition, combined in the mind and craft of a man who embodied all three simultaneously. The great Chinese Buddhist pilgrims who traveled west along the Silk Road to study in India in the 4th through 7th centuries added another dimension to this exchange. Faxian, who departed China around 399 AD and spent 15 years traveling through Central Asia and India before returning by sea, wrote a travelogue that provides one of the most detailed and reliable accounts of Buddhist practice and political conditions across the Asian continent at the turn of the 5th century. Xuanzang, who departed in 629 AD against the express prohibition of Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty, doing it anyway with the specific energy of a person who has decided that the emperor's rules are less important than a 17-year spiritual mission, is probably the most famous traveler in Chinese history, the subject of the classic novel Journey to the West and the carrier of over 600 Buddhist texts back to China, which he spent the rest of his life translating. Xuanzang's journey gives us one of the most vivid pictures of the Silk Road as an intellectual highway. Traveling through Samarkand, he encountered a Zoroastrian king who was initially hostile but became curious after hearing him preach and allowed a monastic assembly. Traveling through the oasis kingdoms of Central Asia, he documented the specific schools of Buddhist philosophy practiced in each, the number of monasteries and monks, the condition of the sacred sites he visited. Arriving in India, he studied at Nalanda, the great Buddhist university in northeastern India, a monastic institution with thousands of resident students studying not just Buddhist philosophy, but logic, grammar, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. For 5 years, debating with the finest scholars of the tradition before traveling extensively across the subcontinent. What Xuanzang brought back to China was not simply a collection of texts. It was a living intellectual tradition, a set of questions, methods, and frameworks for inquiry that had been developing for nearly 1,000 years in Indian philosophy.
transplanted into Chinese intellectual soil. The encounter between Buddhist philosophy and the existing Chinese traditions of Confucianism and Taoism produced intellectual syntheses of extraordinary richness. Chan Buddhism, known in Japan as Zen, emerged from the encounter between Indian Buddhist meditation practice and Chinese Taoist thought about the nature of mind and reality. Pure Land Buddhism adapted Indian devotional traditions to the Chinese social emphasis on filial piety and communal religious practice. Tiantai and Huayan schools developed sophisticated philosophical systems that had no direct Indian equivalent, drawing on Indian epistemology and Chinese metaphysics in combinations that neither tradition could have produced independently. All of this, the entire intellectual richness of East Asian Buddhism, which shaped the literature, art, music, architecture, ethics, and political philosophy of China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam for the past 2,000 years, began with a monk sitting beside a merchant at a fire on the edge of the Tarim Basin, somewhere around the 1st century AD, telling a story about a prince who sat beneath a tree. The road carried the story. The story changed everything it touched. While Buddhism was traveling east along the Silk Road, a set of older religious traditions was moving in multiple directions simultaneously, shaping the beliefs of civilizations across the entire breadth of the route. These were the religions of ancient Iran, Zoroastrianism and its restless, syncretic offspring, Manichaeism, and their influence on Western religious thought is so deep and so pervasive that most people who have been shaped by it have no idea it ever happened. Zoroastrianism was founded by the prophet Zoroaster, known in his own language as Zarathustra, somewhere between the 11th and 6th centuries BC, in a location that scholars place variously in northeastern Iran, Central Asia, or the region around the Caspian Sea. The uncertainty about his dates and location is not carelessness on the part of historians, but a reflection of the genuine difficulty of dating very early religious traditions. What is considerably clearer is the content of what Zoroaster taught, because Zoroastrian texts survived, and their intellectual structure is remarkably coherent. Zoroaster proposed a universe organized around the eternal struggle between two fundamental principles: Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, representing truth, light, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, representing lies, darkness, and chaos. Human beings were not passive spectators of this cosmic struggle. They were active participants, whose choices between truth and deception, righteousness and wickedness, genuinely mattered to the outcome. This is called cosmic dualism, and it is an idea of extraordinary influence. The notion that the universe is organized as a struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and falsehood, the divine and the demonic, runs through so much of Western religious and philosophical thought that it seems almost self-evidently true to anyone raised within that tradition. The Book of Job in the Hebrew Bible is organized around a contest between God and an adversarial figure. Christian theology posits a fallen angel, Satan, as the opponent of divine goodness. Islamic theology includes Iblis, the rebellious figure who refuses to bow to Adam. These are not identical to Zoroastrian dualism. Each tradition developed the concept in its own specific direction. But the underlying structure, the moral architecture of a universe organized as a struggle between opposing cosmic forces, reflects Zoroastrian influence that entered Judaism during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, when Jewish communities lived for generations in territories where Zoroastrianism was the dominant religion. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which was Zoroastrian in its state religion, and which conquered Babylon in 539 BC and subsequently ruled much of the Near East, was a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic empire that practiced a form of religious tolerance remarkable for its time. Cyrus the Great allowed the Jewish exiles in Babylon to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple, an act that the Hebrew Bible celebrates as divinely ordained. The extended contact between Jewish and Zoroastrian intellectual traditions during the Persian period left marks on Jewish theology. Concepts of angels and demons as organized spiritual beings, ideas about cosmic judgment and resurrection, the figure of an adversarial spiritual being opposed to God, that carried forward into early Christianity and Islam. The road between these traditions was not the Silk Road in the formal sense, but it was the same corridor, the same territory, the same meeting of civilizations that the Silk Road would later formalize and intensify. Historians still argue whether the specific influence of Zoroastrianism on Jewish theology was transmitted primarily through direct cultural contact during the Babylonian exile, or through the administrative culture of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, or through some combination of both. And the argument is likely to remain unresolved, because the relevant texts are not explicit about their sources. What is clearer is that by the time the Silk Road was operating at full intensity during the Parthian and Sassanid periods, Zoroastrian ideas about cosmic dualism, the nature of evil, and the moral structure of the universe were already embedded in the major religious traditions of the Middle East, and they continued to travel and evolve along the route. Then came Mani, and things got genuinely interesting. Mani was born in 216 AD in Babylonia, in the territory of what is now Iraq, into a community that practiced a Jewish-Christian baptismal sect. He had his first vision at the age of 12 and his definitive prophetic calling at 24, and what he subsequently built was arguably the most ambitious religious synthesis in the history of the ancient world. Manichaeism, the religion founded by Mani, deliberately incorporated elements from Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism into a single theological system organized around a radical dualism. The universe was divided between the realm of light, which was spirit, truth,
and goodness, and the realm of darkness, which was matter, deception, and evil. The human soul was a fragment of divine light trapped in the material darkness of the body, and the purpose of religious practice was to liberate that light and return it to its divine source. This is a beautiful and logically consistent system, and it spread with remarkable speed along the Silk Road in both directions. Manichaeism traveled west into the Roman Empire, where it became a serious competitor with Christianity for the allegiance of educated people in the 3rd and 4th centuries. It traveled east through Persia and Central Asia, carried by Sogdian merchants who found its universal claims. Its insistence that it was the complete and final revelation that superseded all previous religions, commercially appealing in a trade environment that constantly required its practitioners to negotiate between multiple cultural systems. It reached China in the 7th century and found followers there. The most consequential single convert to Manichaeism in Western history was a young North African man of exceptional intelligence who was looking, in the late 4th century, for a philosophical framework adequate to explain the presence of evil in a universe allegedly created by a good God. His name was Augustine of Hippo, and he spent 9 years as a Manichaean before converting to Christianity around 386 AD. After his conversion, Augustine became one of the most influential theologians in the history of Western Christianity, and he spent considerable intellectual energy arguing against Manichaeism, a religion he knew from the inside, with the specific passion of someone arguing against a position they have personally abandoned. His arguments shaped the development of Christian theology in ways that are still felt today, and his arguments were shaped by his Manichaean past in ways that he would have been the first to deny. Some modern scholars of Augustine argue that his theology retained more Manichaean structural elements than he acknowledged, that his emphasis on the radical corruption of human nature, his sharp distinction between the earthly city and the city of God, his deeply ambivalent relationship with physical pleasure and material reality, all reflect a residual dualist sensibility that Manichaean thought had embedded so deeply that even a decade of Christian theology could not entirely dislodge it. This is a minority scholarly position, and Augustine's defenders contest it vigorously. But it illustrates the way ideas travel, not just as explicit doctrines that people consciously adopt and defend, but as ways of seeing, structural assumptions about how reality is organized that can persist in a mind long after the specific system that generated them has been rejected. The Silk Road carried these Persian ideas westward at the same time it was carrying Buddhist ideas eastward, and both currents were mixing with everything they encountered along the way. Greek philosophy, Jewish theology, local animist and shamanist traditions, the music and art and storytelling of dozens of different peoples. By the time Islam emerged in the 7th century and swept across the Middle East and Central Asia with astonishing speed, it was entering a world whose intellectual landscape had been deeply shaped by 1,500 years of Silk Road exchange. And Islam, with its own specific genius for synthesis and its own powerful trading networks, was about to take the entire accumulated intellectual inheritance of this road and carry it somewhere entirely new. In the year 632 AD, the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina, and within a century of his death, the religion he had founded had spread from the Arabian Peninsula across Persia, Central Asia, North Africa, and into Spain. One of the most rapid territorial expansions of a cultural and religious system in recorded history. This expansion was not simply military. It was intellectual, commercial, and deeply connected to the trade networks of the Silk Road that had been operating for 7 centuries before the Prophet's birth. The Arab merchants who carried Islam east and west along the routes were doing exactly what Sogdian merchants had been doing before them.
moving goods and ideas simultaneously, conducting commerce and conversion in the same journeys, using the practical infrastructure of trade to accomplish something that went far beyond profit. The Abbasid Caliphate, which came to power in 750 AD and established its capital at Baghdad, built what may be the single most important institution in the history of the transmission of ideas between civilizations, the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Baghdad itself was founded in 762 AD by Caliph al-Mansur in a location that was not an accident. It sat at the precise point where the Silk Road's overland routes from Central Asia and Persia converged with the river networks of the Tigris and Euphrates that connected it to the Persian Gulf and the maritime trading world. Baghdad was, in its physical location, a Silk Road city, positioned to receive intellectual traffic from every direction simultaneously. The House of Wisdom, established under Harun al-Rashid and expanded under his son al-Mamun in the early 9th century, was at once a library, a translation institute, a research academy, and a gathering place for the finest scholars that the Islamic world, which now stretched from Spain to Central Asia, could attract. The caliphs paid their translators salaries that one contemporary source compares to the earnings of today's most successful professionals, which is either an inspiring reflection of how seriously they took scholarship or a reminder that the prestige economy of knowledge has always been comfortable paying well for people it really wants. The translation project they sponsored was unprecedented in ambition. The systematic conversion into Arabic of everything worth knowing that existed in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac. The 4 great scholarly languages of the civilizations that Islam had encountered and absorbed. What made the House of Wisdom's project possible was a specific combination of factors that the Silk Road had assembled. The texts themselves, Greek philosophical and scientific works, had survived in the libraries of the Byzantine Empire and in the Syriac-speaking Christian communities of Syria and Mesopotamia, whose scholars had been translating and commenting on Greek texts since the 3rd century. Many of the House of Wisdom's most important translators were not Muslim Arabs, but Nestorian Christians, members of the Church of the East, the very tradition that had carried Nestorian Christianity along the Silk Road to China, and whose bilingual, multicultural character made its scholars perfectly positioned for the translation work. The most celebrated of these was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a 9th century Nestorian Christian physician who translated more than 100 texts of Galen alone, along with works of Aristotle, Plato, Hippocrates, and Ptolemy, into both Syriac and Arabic, with a scholarly precision that later European translators found invaluable. The paper on which these translations were written was itself a Silk Road transmission. Paper had been invented in China, and the knowledge of how to make it had traveled west along the Silk Road. The traditional account places the transmission at the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, when Arab forces defeated a Tang dynasty army and captured Chinese papermakers among the prisoners of war, who then established paper mills in Samarkand. Whether the Talas story is precisely accurate in every detail is questioned by some scholars, but the timing is real. Paper mills appeared in Samarkand shortly after the battle, then in Baghdad, then in Syria, Egypt, Morocco, and eventually Spain. By the time the House of Wisdom's translators were doing their most important work in the 9th century, they had paper to write on that was cheaper, lighter, and more convenient than papyrus or parchment. And that came from a Chinese invention transmitted by exactly the same Central Asian trade networks that were delivering Greek texts and Indian mathematics to Baghdad simultaneously. The mathematical tradition that the House of Wisdom synthesized and developed is where the Silk Road's intellectual legacy becomes most concretely visible in the world you live in today. Indian mathematicians had developed, over several centuries, a positional decimal number system that included a symbol for 0. The crucial conceptual breakthrough that allows a positional system to work by providing a placeholder for empty positions. This system was transmitted to the Islamic world through Sanskrit mathematical texts, some of which may have arrived in Baghdad as diplomatic gifts from Indian rulers, and some of which almost certainly traveled with merchants along the commercial routes that connected the Indian subcontinent to the Persian Gulf and thence to Baghdad. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, working at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century, synthesized this Indian numerical tradition with Greek geometric methods and Persian algebraic techniques to produce 2 books that changed the history of mathematics. The first, on the use of Indian numerals, was translated into Latin in the 12th century as Algorithmi de Numero Indorum, and algorithmi was simply the Latin transliteration of al-Khwarizmi's name, from which we get the word algorithm. The second book, Al-Kitab al-Muqtazar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, gave us the word algebra from al-Jabr in its title. The system of arithmetic that all school children learn, the concepts of algebra that underlie all of higher mathematics, and the very vocabulary that describes them, are the legacy of a scholar at the House of Wisdom in 9th century Baghdad, working with Indian numbers transmitted along the Silk Road trade routes. There is a particularly satisfying irony here that is worth pausing on for just a moment. The Roman numeral system that Al-Khwarizmi's work eventually displaced in European usage.
The awkward, clumsy Roman numeral system that used letters and that makes doing arithmetic feel like solving a puzzle, was in every practical sense inferior to the Indian positional system for almost every mathematical purpose. European merchants who had to multiply Roman numerals to calculate a trade profit must have felt, on encountering Arabic numerals for the first time, something like the specific relief of a person who has been carrying groceries in their bare arms suddenly offered a bag. The bag, in this case, came from India via Baghdad, via the Silk Road, and it arrived in Europe around 1,000 years after it was invented. Better late than never. Historians still argue whether the Islamic Golden Age, the extraordinary flowering of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature that Baghdad represented from roughly the 8th through the 13th centuries, was primarily a preservation and transmission of earlier knowledge, or whether it was a genuinely original creative tradition that built substantially new intellectual structures. On the foundations it inherited, the answer is clearly both, and the debate itself is somewhat artificial, because the distinction between preservation and creation dissolves when you look closely at what the House of Wisdom scholars actually did. They did not simply copy Aristotle into Arabic. They read him, argued with him, corrected him where the evidence required it, and developed his ideas in directions he had not anticipated. The result was not Greek philosophy in Arabic dress, but something new. An intellectual tradition that had genuinely synthesized the best of multiple civilizations into an original and enormously productive whole. That whole was about to begin its journey into Western Europe, carried again by the mechanisms of trade and the movement of people, along routes that were the westward extensions of the same Silk Road network that had carried Buddhism to China and Zoroastrianism to Babylon. The road never stopped moving. The ideas never stopped traveling. In the year 1085 AD, the Christian armies of Alfonso VI of Castile captured the city of Toledo from its Muslim rulers, and the scholars who followed the armies into the city found something in the libraries there that changed the course of Western history. Toledo had been under Islamic governance since the Moorish conquest of Spain in 711 AD, and in the 4 centuries of that administration, it had accumulated one of the finest collections of Arabic manuscripts in the Western Mediterranean world. Texts of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural science that represented the full achievement of the Islamic Golden Age, many of them translations, of Greek originals that had not been available in Latin-speaking Europe for centuries. The Christian scholars who began reading these texts and translating them from Arabic into Latin were doing something that they understood as recovering lost ancient knowledge, but what they were actually doing was inheriting the output of the Silk Road. The accumulated intellectual synthesis of Baghdad, which was itself the accumulated intellectual synthesis of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian traditions. The translation movement centered in Toledo in the 12th and 13th centuries was the mechanism by which the intellectual legacy of the Silk Road entered medieval Europe. Translators came from across Christendom to work in Toledo, from England, from Italy, from France, from Germany, drawn by access to texts that were available nowhere else in the Latin-speaking world. Gerard of Cremona, who arrived in Toledo around 1140 and spent the rest of his life translating, produced over 80 translations, including Ptolemy's Almagest, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, and Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra, a single scholar's output that constituted a significant fraction of the entire intellectual inheritance that medieval European universities would be built upon. What these translators were carrying back to Paris and Oxford and Bologna in their saddlebags was not simply a collection of old books. It was a set of tools, mathematical, philosophical, and scientific, that dramatically expanded what European thinkers could do. The rediscovery of Aristotle's complete works through Arabic translations produced a philosophical crisis in medieval European universities that lasted for generations. Aristotle's logical and scientific methods, his systematic approach to categorizing and analyzing the natural world, his framework for thinking about causation and explanation were so sophisticated compared to what European scholars had been working with that the encounter produced both enormous excitement and genuine alarm. Church authorities worried, not unreasonably, that Aristotelian reason was a dangerous tool that might undermine theological authority if applied without constraint to questions about God and the universe.
the great project of scholastic theology. The tradition associated above all with Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, but developed by dozens of thinkers across 2 centuries, was essentially an attempt to reconcile Aristotelian reason with Christian revelation, to show that the tools of Greek philosophy, transmitted through Arabic scholarship, were compatible with rather than destructive of Christian faith. Aquinas' Summa Theologica, one of the most ambitious works of systematic philosophy ever written, is inconceivable without the Arabic transmission of Aristotle. The 5 rational proofs of God's existence that Aquinas offers, arguments from motion, causation, contingency, gradation, and design, are adapted from Aristotelian metaphysics, mediated through the work of Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes, who had already been wrestling with the same question of how Greek reason and revealed religion could coexist. Averroes, Ibn Rushd in Arabic, was a 12th century Andalusian philosopher whose commentaries on Aristotle were so thorough and so authoritative that European scholars simply called him the commentator, as they called Aristotle himself, the philosopher, both titles requiring no further specification. His work was translated into Latin at Toledo and became the primary medium through which medieval European philosophers encountered Aristotle, which means that the intellectual formation of virtually every major European philosopher from the 13th century onward was filtered through the mind of a 12th century Muslim scholar from Cordoba, whose own thinking had been shaped by the Islamic Golden Age in Baghdad, which had itself been shaped by the translation of Greek texts by Nestorian Christian scholars who were heirs to the same Persian cultural tradition that the Silk Road had created. The medical knowledge that traveled the same route had equally transformative consequences for European practice. Avicenna, Ibn Sina in Arabic, born in 980 AD in Bukhara, one of the great Silk Road cities of Central Asia, wrote the Canon of Medicine, a systematic encyclopedia of medical knowledge that synthesized Greek medicine as represented by Galen and Hippocrates with Persian, Indian, and Islamic medical traditions. The canon organized medical knowledge into a comprehensive system that covered general principles of medicine, simple drugs, diseases organized by body system, conditions affecting the whole body, and compound medications. A structure of such clarity and comprehensiveness that it was used as the primary medical textbook in European universities from its translation in the 12th century until well into the 17th century. A physician trained at the University of Padua in 1400 was working within a framework of understanding built by a scholar born in a Silk Road city in Central Asia 4 centuries earlier. The astronomical knowledge that entered Europe through the same channels was equally foundational. Islamic astronomers had built on Greek astronomical traditions, particularly the work of Ptolemy, and had corrected and extended them through centuries of systematic observation. The star names that modern astronomers still use, Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Vega, Deneb, Altair, are Arabic, reflecting the Islamic world's central role in medieval astronomy. The astrolabe, the primary astronomical instrument of the medieval and early modern period, was refined and elaborated in Islamic workshops to a degree of precision and versatility that Greek prototypes had not achieved. The angular measurements that Islamic astronomers made of planetary positions, collected over centuries in the astronomical tables called Z, gave European astronomy a database of observation that underpinned the calculations of Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo. The Silk Road's contribution to the scientific revolution, the great transformation of European natural philosophy in the 16th and 17th centuries that produced the modern scientific method, is therefore not incidental or peripheral. It is structural. The data, the tools, the mathematical methods, and the philosophical frameworks that made the scientific revolution possible were assembled along the Silk Road and its extensions, transmitted from China and India and Persia and Greece through the intellectual clearinghouse of Baghdad, and deposited at the doors of European universities through the translations of Toledo. Without that chain of transmission, the scientific revolution as it actually happened, with the specific tools and data that Copernicus and Galileo and Newton actually used, would not have been possible in the form it took. This is not a small thing. It is the foundation of the modern world. The irony that the European tradition has consistently told itself is a story of Greek origins, of a civilization building directly on the legacy of Athens and Rome, with the Islamic and Asian contributions reduced to the role of custodians holding texts in storage until Europeans were ready to use them, is one of the more consequential misreadings of intellectual history. The House of Wisdom scholars were not custodians. They were creators. The Toledo translators were not recovering a lost inheritance. They were inheriting a synthesis. The road that brought these ideas west was not a passive conduit. It was a laboratory, And the experiments it ran over 15 centuries produced results that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted. There is a 10-foot stone tablet standing in a museum in Xi'an, China, the city that was the eastern starting point of the Silk Road, that was carved in the year 781 AD, buried sometime in the 840s to protect it from religious persecution, and not rediscovered until the early 17th century. When Jesuit missionaries working in China came across it in 1625, they could barely believe what they were reading. The inscription on the tablet, written in both Chinese and Syriac, described the arrival of a Christian missionary named Alopen in the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an in 635 AD, nearly 1,000 years before the missionaries who discovered the tablet, and the establishment of a Christian community that had been practicing and growing for 150 years at the time the stone was carved. The tablet is called the Nestorian Stele, and it is one of the most remarkable artifacts of Silk Road cultural exchange that survives anywhere on Earth. Christianity, it turned out, had reached China before tea reached England, before algebra reached Europe, and before most people in medieval Christendom had any idea that China existed. The Christianity that traveled the Silk Road was not the Roman Catholicism of medieval Europe. It was a different tradition, the Church of the East, known in Western scholarship as Nestorian Christianity after Nestorius, a 5th century patriarch of Constantinople whose theological positions on the nature of Christ were condemned as heresy by the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD. The communities that followed the Church of the East and rejected the Council's authority moved eastward, establishing their primary institutional base in Persia and using the Silk Road's trade networks as their missionary highway. They were extraordinarily well positioned for this work.
The Church of the East's liturgical language was Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic closely related to the language that Jesus himself spoke. Syriac-speaking communities were already embedded across the Middle East and Central Asia, and Syriac scribes and scholars were among the most intellectually sophisticated people in the late antique world, the same Nestorian scholars who would later do so much of the translation work at Baghdad's House of Wisdom. The Nestorian Stele's inscription describes the Christian faith in language that would have struck Roman Catholic readers as slightly disorienting. It uses Buddhist and Confucian vocabulary to explain Christian concepts, describing Christian teachings in terms familiar to Chinese readers rather than insisting on the specific Greek and Latin theological terminology that Western Christianity employed. The Christian God is described using the Chinese term for the highest divine principle. Christian saints are described in ways that echo Buddhist bodhisattvas. The missionaries responsible for the stele were not abandoning their faith. They were translating it, in the deepest sense of the word, into a cultural vocabulary that could be understood by the people they were addressing. This adaptive strategy, which allowed the Church of the East to operate across an enormous range of cultural contexts, was itself a product of the Silk Road environment, a trade route environment where the ability to communicate across cultural difference was a basic survival skill, and where insisting on a single cultural form for any message guaranteed that the message would fail to travel. The Silk Road was also a highway for Judaism, which had its own long history of following trade routes into new territories and establishing communities that maintained cultural continuity across great distances while adapting to local conditions. Jewish merchants were active along the Silk Road routes from very early in the road's history, and Jewish communities existed in Persia, in the Sassanid Empire's territories, and eventually in Central Asia and China throughout the period of the road's operation. The Radhanites, a network of Jewish merchants operating from roughly the 8th to the 10th centuries AD, whose name may derive from the Rhone Valley in France or from a Persian term, with scholars genuinely unable to agree, operated trading routes that connected Western Europe to China, crossing both the overland Silk Road and the maritime routes, and trading in silk, furs, spices, weapons, and enslaved people, carrying goods and information across the entire breadth of the known world. The existence of a trading network that regularly connected Carolingian France to Tang Dynasty China in the 9th century is one of those facts that tends to produce a moment of genuine cognitive reorientation when you encounter it for the first time. Charlemagne's court and the court of the Tang Emperor Xuanzong were not simply vague theoretical contemporaries occupying different parts of the same planet. They were connected by networks of commerce, by the movement of luxury goods, by diplomatic exchanges, and by the movement of ideas that accompanied all of these. Charlemagne received an elephant as a diplomatic gift from the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid in 802 AD, a gift that required the elephant to travel from Baghdad across the Mediterranean to Ashan. The same networks that carried the elephant were carrying silk, and the same networks were carrying ideas. The spread of Islam along the Silk Road after the 7th century added another powerful religious current to the already complex mixture.
Islamic merchants traveling east along the trade routes brought their faith with them in exactly the way that Buddhist monks and Nestorian Christians had done before them. Not as official missionaries on state-sponsored campaigns, but as individual believers living according to their principles in a commercial environment that required daily interaction with people of very different beliefs. The Islamic trading diaspora that established itself across Central Asia, coastal India, Southeast Asia, and eventually the ports of southern China was one of the primary mechanisms by which Islam became a world religion rather than an Arabian one. The communities of Muslim merchants in port cities from Quanzhou in southern China to Calicut in India to Aden in Yemen became permanent features of the social landscape, maintaining mosques and madrasas, educating the children of mixed marriages, and gradually converting portions of the local population through the accumulated weight of commercial relationship and personal example rather than through formal missionary activity. The specific quality of Islam that made it travel well along trade routes was not merely its theological content, though the clarity and accessibility of Islamic monotheism. The direct, unmediated relationship between the individual believer and God that Islamic theology emphasizes had broad appeal. It was also the practical framework that Islamic law and commercial ethics provided for conducting business. Islamic law had developed sophisticated instruments for financing trade, partnerships, bills of exchange, credit arrangements that allowed Muslim merchants to operate across enormous distances with a degree of mutual trust and predictability that the commercial environment of the Silk Road required.
A Muslim merchant in Samarkand doing business with a Muslim merchant in Guangzhou could rely on a shared framework of contract, obligation, and ethical expectation that reduced the transaction costs of long-distance trade in ways that were genuinely valuable. Religion was, in this context, also a commercial infrastructure. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road's primary mechanism of religious transmission was top-down, driven by the deliberate missionary strategies of organized religious institutions, or bottom-up, driven by the informal personal witness of individual merchants, soldiers, and travelers whose lives embodied their beliefs in public view. The evidence suggests that both mechanisms operated, but that the bottom-up transmission was probably more consistent and more durable, because it continued operating even when official missionary activity was disrupted by political changes. The merchants kept moving, and as long as they kept moving, the ideas kept traveling. The Nestorian stele, buried in the 840s during a period of Tang dynasty persecution of foreign religions, was an attempt to preserve the evidence of a community's existence against the possibility that the community itself might not survive. It did survive, in altered and diminished form. The stone has survived intact, now residing in the Xi'an Beilin Museum, still carrying its bilingual testimony to a moment when Christianity and Chinese civilization met on equal terms, each curious about the other, each willing to translate itself into the other's vocabulary, each changed by the encounter. That willingness to translate, to genuinely engage rather than simply announce, was the intellectual attitude that made the Silk Road work as a highway of ideas. Without it, the road would have moved only goods. There is a word that entered the English language from Arabic, which entered Arabic from Persian, which entered Persian from Sanskrit, which entered Sanskrit from a root that botanists now trace back to a plant that grew in the foothills of northeastern India around 4,000 years ago. The word is sugar. It arrived in Europe via the Arab traders of the Silk Road and Mediterranean maritime routes, and it arrived not just as a commodity, but as a concept. An entirely new category of flavor that European cuisine had not previously had in the form of a reliable, concentrated, portable sweetener available in significant commercial quantities. Sugar changed what Europeans ate, how they cooked, and ultimately how they organized large portions of their agricultural economy. It arrived on the same road that brought algebra and Buddhism and Nestorian Christianity, carried by the same networks of merchants who were simultaneously moving philosophical texts and religious ideas and musical instruments across the breadth of Eurasia. This convergence of the material and the intellectual in a single trading network is one of the most important things to understand about how the Silk Road worked as a transmitter of ideas. The road did not have separate lanes for goods and concepts. Everything traveled together in the same caravans, carried by the same people, stopping at the same caravanserais. A merchant whose camel was loaded with Chinese silk might have a conversation at a caravanserai in Merv with a Persian physician who was traveling to Baghdad carrying a collection of Greek medical texts, and that conversation might plant an idea about botanical medicine in the merchant's mind that he would carry home to Samarkand and share with the local healer, who would incorporate it into her practice.
which would eventually influence the treatment of disease in a city that the Greek physician whose text started the chain had never heard of. This is not a hypothetical. This is roughly how the Silk Road worked for 15 centuries, at the level of individual human encounters that left no record, but whose cumulative effect is visible in everything, from the words embedded in European languages to the mathematical systems underlying modern computing. The food that traveled the Silk Road is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of its cultural exchange, and the ideas embedded in that food, about taste, about agriculture, about the organization of human pleasure, are ideas whose transmission along the trade routes profoundly shaped the cultures at both ends. The movement of agricultural knowledge was as consequential as the movement of philosophical texts, and the two were often carried by the same people. Grapes and winemaking knowledge traveled east from the Mediterranean world into Central Asia and China during the Han Dynasty period. Chinese records describe Zhang Qian bringing back grape seeds from his Central Asian missions as one of his most practically significant contributions to Chinese agriculture. Rice traveled west from Southeast Asia along multiple routes. Cotton traveled from India to the Middle East and eventually to Mediterranean Europe. Lemons, oranges, and other citrus fruits originated in South and Southeast Asia and reached the Mediterranean world through the trade routes of the Islamic period. Eggplant, spinach, and artichokes all entered European cuisine through the same channel. The spices, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, nutmeg, that were among the Silk Road's most valuable commodities were also among its most idea-laden, because each spice came embedded in a culinary tradition, a set of medical beliefs about its properties, and a cultural context of use that traveled with it. Medieval European medicine understood spices not primarily as flavoring agents, but as pharmaceuticals, concentrated plant essences with specific effects on the human body's balance of humors, warmth, and vital spirits. This medical theory of spices was itself a Silk Road transmission, a fusion of Greek humoral medicine, Indian Ayurvedic theory, and Persian pharmaceutical tradition that arrived in European medical texts through the Arabic translations of Toledo. When a medieval European physician prescribed pepper for digestive complaints or cinnamon for a cold, he was working within a theoretical framework that had been assembled from at least 3 different medical traditions along the Silk Road and transmitted to him through the intermediary of Islamic medical scholarship. The spice itself, the theory explaining its action, and the commercial network that made it available were all products of the same road. The transmission of agricultural techniques was equally significant and equally underappreciated. Irrigation technologies developed in Persia. The Qanat system of underground water channels that could move water from mountain aquifers to desert settlements across distances of many kilometers, spread eastward into Central Asia and westward into the Islamic world and eventually into Spain, where Moorish engineers built sophisticated water management systems that transformed the agricultural productivity of the Iberian Peninsula and whose influence can still be traced in the landscape of Andalusia today. Cotton cultivation, which required specific irrigation techniques and specific processing knowledge to convert the raw fiber into usable thread, spread from India through Persia to the Middle East and eventually to Mediterranean Europe, carrying with it not just a plant but an entire agricultural and industrial system. The exchange of agricultural ideas along the Silk Road had a demographic dimension that is easy to overlook. New food crops that could be grown in previously marginal conditions, drought-resistant crops from arid Central Asian environments, high-yield varieties developed in the intensively cultivated river valleys of China and India, increased the carrying capacity of agricultural land across the Eurasian continent in ways that supported population growth that in turn supported the urban complexity that was necessary for the production and transmission of the intellectual culture we have been tracing. The population of medieval Europe, which grew significantly between the 10th and 13th centuries, the same period when Islamic agricultural innovations were being absorbed into European farming practice through the contact zones of Spain and Sicily, was partly sustained by crop varieties and farming techniques that came down the same road as Avicenna's medical canon and Al-Khwarizmi's algebra. There is a particularly satisfying chain of cause and effect here that is worth following explicitly. The Silk Road transmitted paper-making technology from China to the Islamic world, which gave Baghdad's scholars cheap material to write on, which enabled the enormous output of the House of Wisdom, which produced the texts that Toledo's translators carried to European universities, which gave those universities the mathematical tools to calculate agricultural yields and astronomical positions, and architectural stresses, which supported the engineering projects and the philosophical confidence that contributed to the intellectual transformation of Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries that historians call the medieval Renaissance, a period of cultural flowering that preceded and prepared the ground for the Italian Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries. The food on the table at a medieval European banquet, spiced with pepper from India, sweetened with sugar from the Middle East, accompanied by wine made from a vine variety, perhaps introduced via Roman-era trade, in a room whose plastered walls reflected a technique that had traveled from the Islamic world, was not simply nourishment. It was a material summary of every trade route and cultural encounter that had connected Europe to the rest of the world over the previous millennium. The merchant who provided the pepper had ancestors who had been trading on the Silk Road since before the fall of Rome. The idea that you would want to eat pepper had come from a medical tradition that had been assembled in Baghdad from Indian and Greek and Persian sources and transmitted to Europe through Arabic scholarship. The spoon that brought it to your lips was probably made in a technology that had traveled from somewhere east of Persia. We eat, still, the ideas of the Silk Road. We just rarely think to wonder where dinner came from. In the autumn of 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian boy boarded a ship with his father and his uncle and began a journey that would take him across the Mediterranean, through the Middle East, over the Pamir Mountains, through the Gobi Desert, and eventually to the court of Kublai Khan in what is now Beijing. A journey of roughly 3.5 years that would change how Europeans thought about the world, probably more than any other single act of travel in the medieval period. His name was Marco Polo, and the book he eventually produced about his experiences, dictated to a fellow prisoner in Genoa while he was being held there after a naval battle around 1298, was the most influential travel account in European history, a work that shaped Western ideas about Asia, about wealth, about the diversity of human civilization, and about the size and complexity of the world centuries after its author's death.
The journey was possible because of a specific historical circumstance that had temporarily transformed the Silk Road from a challenging and dangerous network of regional trade into something approaching a continent-spanning highway under unified political management. The Mongol Empire, which Genghis Khan had begun building in 1206, and his successors had expanded to cover the largest contiguous land territory any empire has ever controlled, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Poland and Hungary, had imposed on this territory a period of relative peace and commercial order that historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Roads were maintained. A postal relay system called the Yam provided horses and communication across the entire empire. Standard commercial regulations reduced the arbitrary toll collection and political friction that normally made long-distance trade expensive and unpredictable. And the Mongol Khans, who were religiously pluralistic in a way that was unusual for the political culture of the period. The ruling family included Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, shamanists, and eventually Muslims without apparent theological anxiety, created a political environment in which merchants, missionaries, diplomats, and travelers of very different backgrounds could move across enormous distances with a reasonable expectation of safety. The passport that Marco Polo's party carried, a golden tablet issued by Kublai Khan that commanded all subjects of the empire to provide them with horses, food, shelter, and any assistance they required, was a physical manifestation of this Pax Mongolica in a portable form. It was also, in practical terms, one of the most powerful travel documents in human history, a guarantee from the ruler of a third of the world's land surface that the bearer was to be helped, not hindered. Marco Polo carried it through what are now Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and China. And it worked. The Mongol imperial postal system, the Yam, had stations at intervals of approximately 25 to 40 kilometers across the empire's territory, and at its height employed hundreds of thousands of horses and tens of thousands of riders. A message sent from Beijing could reach Persia in weeks. A merchant following the postal routes could cross territory that would previously have taken months of dangerous negotiation in a fraction of the time and with a fraction of the risk. The Pax Mongolica lasted roughly from the mid-13th century to the mid-14th century, 100 years during which the Silk Road operated at an intensity of traffic that it had never previously achieved and would never achieve again. This was the century in which European merchants, diplomats, and missionaries traveled east in significant numbers for the first time, encountering directly a civilization that previously they had known only through the filtered accounts of Arabic intermediaries and the garbled reports of occasional earlier travelers. What they found was deeply disorienting in ways that proved productive. China under the Mongols was, in several measurable respects, more sophisticated than contemporary Europe. It had paper money when Europe was still working primarily with coin. It had canal systems of extraordinary engineering complexity. It had cities of a scale, Hangzhou,
which Marco Polo called Quinsai and described as the greatest city in the world, with a population he estimated at approximately 1.5 million, that dwarfed anything in Europe. It had a coal-burning industry that shocked European visitors who had never seen the black stones that the Chinese burned for heat and manufacturing. It had a civil service recruited through examinations rather than birth, an idea so radical by European medieval standards that it would not be seriously implemented in Europe until the 19th century. Marco Polo's account of these things was not always believed by his European readers, who found some of his descriptions of Chinese civilization implausible, not because he was lying, but because the realities he was describing exceeded the imaginative framework available to a medieval European audience. The extraordinary wealth of Chinese cities, the scale of Chinese agricultural production, the sophistication of Chinese administrative systems. These required a mental recalibration that some readers performed willingly and others refused. There is a story, probably apocryphal but persistently repeated, that on his deathbed Polo was urged by friends to retract the implausible elements of his account, and replied that he had not told half of what he had seen. Whether or not the story is true, it captures something real about the relationship between the Silk Road's realities and the Western imagination's capacity to absorb them. What Polo's book did for European intellectual history is something specific and measurable. It created an appetite, a sustained, powerful, commercially motivated desire to access the wealth of Asia directly, without the chain of Islamic and Central Asian middlemen who currently controlled the overland routes and extracted their margin at every stage. This desire, combined with the navigational tools and mathematical techniques that had arrived in Europe through the Arabic transmission of the Islamic Golden Age, the compass, trigonometry, the astronomical tables that allowed latitude calculation, eventually produced the Age of Exploration. Christopher Columbus, who sailed west in 1492, hoping to reach Asia by a route that bypassed the overland Silk Road entirely, was carrying a copy of Marco Polo's book with him, annotated in his own hand. The specific geographical miscalculations that led Columbus to underestimate the circumference of the Earth were themselves partly the result of taking Polo's account of Asian geography too literally, combined with a misreading of Islamic geographical estimates. The Americas were therefore, in a very indirect but real sense, encountered by Europeans as a consequence of their desire to access the goods that the Silk Road had been delivering to them. Silk, spices, and the other Asian luxuries whose overland route was becoming increasingly expensive and politically problematic after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. The road that began in a Chinese silkworm garden did not merely carry silk to Rome and algebra to Toledo. It eventually, through the chain of consequences it set in motion, led a Genoese sailor to a continent that none of the road's architects had imagined.
Historians still argue whether the Pax Mongolica's intensification of east-west contact was ultimately more important for the ideas it transmitted or for the plague it carried. The Black Death, which originated in the Central Asian steppe and traveled along the Silk Road trade routes to reach the Crimea in 1346 and the rest of Europe by 1347, killing roughly a third of Europe's population and permanently, altering its social structure, its labor economics, its theology, and its sense of the relationship between human civilization and natural catastrophe. Both consequences were real. The road carried the best and worst of what civilizations had to offer in both directions, without discrimination or preference, because roads do not sort their traffic. The Mongol peace ended as it began, in violence. But what had traveled during its century of operations stayed traveled. The ideas were already where they were going. And what was coming next was a revolution. In the spring of 1453, Ottoman artillery reduced the ancient walls of Constantinople to rubble over a period of several weeks, and the city that had served as the western terminus of the Silk Road's overland routes, the point where Asian goods entered the European trading system and where the intellectual inheritance of the Islamic Golden Age had passed into Latin scholarship, fell to a new empire that would reorganize the commercial geography of the Eastern Mediterranean for the next several centuries. The fall of Constantinople is often described in Western historical narrative as a catastrophe for European civilization, an event that severed the connection between Europe and the intellectual traditions of the ancient world and forced the refugees of the Byzantine court, carrying their Greek manuscripts, westward into Italy where they contributed to the Renaissance flowering. This is a partly true story, but also a significantly oversimplified one, and the oversimplification matters because it obscures how thoroughly the Renaissance was already in motion before 1453, and how deeply its roots were embedded in the century-long process of Silk Road transmission that we have been tracing.
The Italian Renaissance, that extraordinary transformation of European art, philosophy, science, and political thought that unfolded from roughly the 14th through the 16th centuries, was not a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It was the culmination of a process that had been building for 200 years, in which the intellectual tools transmitted through the Silk Road via Baghdad and Toledo, Aristotelian logic, Arabic mathematics, Islamic astronomy, the recovered texts of Greek medicine and natural philosophy, had been absorbed into European university culture and were beginning to generate new combinations, new questions, and new methods. The Renaissance humanists, who were usually credited with initiating the transformation, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Bruni, Valla, were working within an intellectual environment already enriched by 2 centuries of engagement with Arabic transmitted Greek philosophy, and their specific contributions were possible partly because that foundation had been laid. The specific ingredients of the Renaissance, the revival of classical literary and artistic forms, the development of perspective in painting, the beginnings of empirical natural science, the revival of Platonic philosophy alongside Aristotelian logic, all had connections to the Silk Road's intellectual legacy, though these connections are rarely told as such. The development of linear perspective in Italian Renaissance painting, for instance, which is usually narrated as the achievement of Brunelleschi and Alberti in early 15th century Florence, drew on the optical theory of Al-Haytham. Ibn al-Haytham in Arabic, known to medieval Europeans as Al-Hazan, a 10th and 11th century Islamic scholar whose Kitab al-Manazir, the Book of Optics, was translated into Latin in the 12th century and provided the mathematical and perceptual framework that Renaissance artists used to solve the problem of representing 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional surface. Al-Haytham's theory of vision, that light rays travel from objects to the eye rather than from the eye to objects as Greek theory had suggested, was itself a synthesis of Greek optical theory with experimental methods that represented a genuinely new approach to knowledge, and it produced results that neither Greek nor Roman science had achieved. The Renaissance's embrace of empirical observation as a valid method for acquiring knowledge about the natural world, the shift from the authority of ancient texts to the evidence of direct experience that is usually identified as the beginning of the scientific method, has its intellectual ancestors in exactly this kind of synthesis. Roger Bacon, the 13th century English scholar who is sometimes called one of the first advocates of empirical science in the European tradition, was working directly with Arabic optical texts, including Al-Haytham's work, and explicitly identified Arabic scholarship as the source of the new approach to knowledge he was advocating. His advocacy was not simply a claim that Europeans should read more Arabic books. It was an argument that the Arabic tradition had developed through its synthesis of Greek theory with systematic observation, a method of inquiry that was superior to the pure text commentary tradition that dominated European universities. The printing press, which Gutenberg developed in Mainz around 1450, is the technological turning point that most people point to as the mechanism by which Renaissance ideas spread through European society. But the printing press itself was a Silk Road product in its essential material form. The paper that Gutenberg's press required existed in Europe because paper-making technology had traveled from China through the Islamic world to Spain and then north through Europe over the preceding centuries. The movable type that Gutenberg developed had a Chinese predecessor in the ceramic movable type invented by Bai Sheng in China around 1040 AD. Whether Gutenberg knew of this Chinese precedent is debated and probably unknowable, but the Chinese invention demonstrates that the concept of movable type printing was not unique to Gutenberg's Europe, and that the idea at least had the potential to travel the same routes as everything else. What the printing press did, in the context of our story, was amplify and accelerate a process that had already been underway for centuries. The ideas that the press disseminated across European society in the decades after 1450 were largely ideas that had already arrived through the Silk Road transmission chain. Greek philosophy and Arabic translation, Islamic mathematics, astronomical tables, medical knowledge, geographical information, including the accounts of travelers like Marco Polo, now made accessible in quantities and at prices that allowed a much broader portion of the European population to encounter them. The Protestant Reformation, which could not have happened without the press's ability to distribute Luther's ideas faster than ecclesiastical authority could suppress them, was also a product of this broader intellectual democratization. A development in which a specific set of religious ideas, challenging institutional authority, and insisting on the individual's direct relationship with sacred texts, spread with a speed and completeness that the manuscript culture of the preceding centuries could not have achieved. The irony that the Reformation's challenge to Rome was carried out using a technology whose essential material, paper, was a Chinese invention transmitted through Islamic civilization, is one of the Silk Road's more satisfying historical jokes. The road that had carried Nestorian Christianity to China in the 7th century, and Buddhist philosophy to China in the 1st century, and Greek philosophy to Baghdad in the 8th century, had ultimately put into European hands the material tools required to transform the Christianity that was Rome's legacy. Everything on the road moved in both directions, and nothing moved without changing what it touched. The specific philosophical transformation of the Renaissance that would most directly produce the modern world. The shift from a geocentric to a heliocentric model of the solar system, from a universe organized around human habitation to a universe organized around physical laws that operate independently of human significance, was accomplished by Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton working with mathematical tools and astronomical data that had been assembled along the Silk Road. Copernicus studied at the University of Bologna, where Arabic astronomical tables and Al-Battani's corrections of Ptolemy's calculations were part of the curriculum. Kepler's laws of planetary motion were derived partly from the observational data accumulated over generations by Islamic astronomers. Galileo's telescope revealed a universe whose structure confirmed what the mathematics, inherited through the Arabic transmission of Greek and Indian mathematical traditions, had already suggested. The scientific revolution was not the product of European genius working in isolation. It was the product of European genius working with tools that the Silk Road had delivered, applied to questions that the Silk Road's transmission of Greek and Islamic philosophy had made it possible to ask. The universe that Galileo looked at through his telescope was the same universe that Al-Haytham had studied through his theory of optics, that Al-Battani had mapped through his astronomical tables, that Al-Khwarizmi had calculated through his algebra, that the Indian mathematicians who invented the positional number system had made it computationally possible to analyze. The scientific revolution happened in Europe. Its materials came from everywhere. There is a specific quality of intellectual excitement that happens when a civilization encounters ideas sufficiently foreign to its existing frameworks that it cannot simply absorb them without transformation. When the foreign idea is too interesting and too useful to ignore, but too different from the existing mental furniture to fit without rearrangement. The history of the Silk Road is, in large part, a history of exactly this kind of productive discomfort. And nowhere was this discomfort more generative than in the encounter between European medieval thought and the philosophical tradition that Islamic scholars had preserved, extended, and transmitted from the ancient world. We have already talked about the Toledo translation movement and the arrival of Aristotle in European universities through Arabic texts. But we have not yet talked about what happened in the minds of the European thinkers who received this inheritance. The specific philosophical problems that the encounter with Islamic thought created, the questions it forced open that had been comfortably closed, and the new directions it made possible for European intellectual life.
This is where the Silk Road's influence on Western ideas becomes most intimate and most difficult to trace, because we are talking not about institutional channels or datable translation projects, but about the inner lives of individual thinkers grappling with ideas that exceeded their existing frameworks. The philosopher who epitomizes this encounter most fully is not Aquinas, whose synthesis of Aristotelian reason and Christian theology is usually cited as the culmination of medieval scholasticism. It is a slightly earlier figure, Peter Abelard, who was born in 1079 in Brittany and became, in the first decades of the 12th century, the most celebrated and the most controversial intellectual in Europe. Abelard's method, his insistence on applying logical analysis to theological questions, his willingness to set contradictory authorities against each other and demand a reasoned resolution rather than simply accepting the more venerable opinion, was understood by his contemporaries as a new and dangerous approach to knowledge. It was called dialectic, and its roots were in Aristotelian logic, which had reached European scholars through the Boethian Latin translations of the early 6th century, but which the full Arabic transmission of the 12th century would dramatically extend. Abelard's famous work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, compiled 158 theological questions for which he presented contradictory statements from different authoritative sources without providing resolutions, as an exercise in developing the student's capacity for reasoned analysis. This was scandalous to those who believed that theological truth was a matter of accepting received authority rather than reasoning your way to conclusions. It was exciting to those who had encountered the Arabic philosophical tradition and recognized in Abelard's method something analogous to the rational inquiry that Islamic scholars had been applying to their own theological questions for centuries. The method was not simply borrowed from Arabic scholarship. Abelard's sources were Latin, but the intellectual atmosphere that made his method thinkable was shaped by the knowledge, filtering into European universities from the Islamic world, that systematic reasoned inquiry into difficult questions was possible and productive.
the university itself. That specific institutional form for organizing higher education that emerged in European cities from the late 11th century onward, producing the University of Bologna around 1088, the University of Paris in the 12th century, Oxford in roughly the same period, was an institution that had conceptual parallels in the Islamic world's madrasas and in the great Buddhist monasteries of India and Central Asia. Whether the European university form was directly influenced by Islamic educational institutions or developed independently in response to similar social pressures, the need to train clergy, lawyers, and physicians in increasingly complex societies is a question that scholars debate. What is more clearly documented is that the curriculum of the early European universities was shaped decisively by the Arabic transmitted knowledge that the Toledo translators had made available and that the subjects taught in those universities: theology, logic, natural philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, reflected exactly the synthesis of Greek, Islamic, and ultimately Asian intellectual traditions that the Silk Road had assembled. The medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, which is often described as the earliest European university, and which was certainly the most important center of medical education in Europe from the 9th through the 12th centuries, developed its curriculum in an environment of intense contact with Arabic medical knowledge. Salerno's location in southern Italy, in a region that had been successively under Byzantine, Arab, and Norman control, and that maintained commercial relationships with the Islamic Mediterranean, made it a natural point of entry for Arabic medical texts. The translation of Constantine the African at Salerno in the late 11th century, converting Arabic medical texts into Latin, including works of Hippocrates and Galen that had been transmitted and elaborated by Islamic scholars, was one of the first major instances of the Toledo-style transmission process, and it established the framework within which European medicine would operate for the next 5 centuries. The effect on European medical practice was genuinely transformative. Medieval European medicine before the Arabic transmission was working primarily with a limited set of Latin texts: Pliny's Natural History, some Hippocratic texts, Dioscorides' Pharmacopoeia, that were theoretically organized around the Greek humoral system, but practically very thin in terms of systematic clinical knowledge. What the Arabic transmission brought was a vastly expanded pharmacopoeia, including drugs from the Islamic world's trade networks, ingredients from India, Persia, Central Asia, and eventually China, combined with systematic descriptions of disease processes, clinical observations accumulated over centuries of Islamic medical practice, and a theoretical framework that integrated Greek humoral theory, with the specific contributions of Islamic scholars who had corrected, extended, and in some areas fundamentally revised the Greek authorities. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which became the standard European medical textbook within a generation of its translation, represented the state-of-the-art of medical knowledge from an intellectual tradition that spanned from the Greek world to the borders of China. Its pharmacopoeia included drugs from every corner of the Silk Road trade network. Its clinical descriptions reflected observations made by physicians practicing in environments ranging from the cold highlands of Central Asia to the humid lowlands of Egypt. Its theoretical framework synthesized Greek, Persian, and Indian medical traditions into a coherent system that was, by any reasonable standard, more comprehensive and more accurate than what it replaced. European patients in the 13th century were being treated according to a medical understanding that had been assembled from the accumulated clinical experience of multiple civilizations across the entire breadth of Eurasia. The road, again, had delivered something essential. What all of these transmissions share: the mathematical tools, the philosophical methods, the medical knowledge, the artistic techniques, is a quality that the Silk Road itself embodied: the productive encounter of difference. The road worked as an intellectual highway because the people traveling it were not all going the same direction or carrying the same things. They were moving in multiple directions simultaneously, from multiple starting points, carrying different goods and different ideas, and stopping at the same caravanserais to rest and eat and talk. The conversations that happened in those stopping places were not conversations between equals who already agreed on the fundamentals. They were conversations between people who saw the world differently, used different languages, prayed in different ways, counted in different number systems, and understood the structure of the cosmos through different frameworks. The ideas that emerged from those conversations were not the ideas that any single party had brought to the table. They were new things, generated by the encounter itself. This is the deepest lesson of the Silk Road's intellectual history, and it is one that remains urgently relevant in a world that is continuously tempted to understand cultural exchange as a threat, rather than as the primary mechanism by which human knowledge actually advances. The civilizations that benefited most from the Silk Road were the ones that were most willing to receive foreign ideas without insisting that those ideas become fully domesticated before they were allowed to be useful. Baghdad received Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics and Chinese papermaking and produced algebra. Toledo received Arabic philosophy and produced scholastic theology. Florence received scholastic theology and Arabic optical theory and Islamic mathematics and produced the Renaissance. Each transformation required the willingness to sit with the discomfort of encountering something genuinely foreign, and to discover that the discomfort was actually the beginning of something new. There is a concept in Chinese philosophy called he, harmony, that is distinct from the Western concept of unity. Unity implies sameness, the merging of differences into a single, undifferentiated whole. Harmony implies the productive coexistence of differences, the creation of something beautiful and functional precisely because its components are not identical. A musical chord is harmonious not because all its notes are the same, but because they are different in ways that work together. A well-prepared meal is harmonious not because all its ingredients taste the same, but because their different flavors balance and enhance each other. The Chinese Confucian tradition contrasted he with tong, mere agreement, the empty consensus of people who simply echo each other rather than genuinely engaging. He required difference. Tong was its pale imitation. The Silk Road operated on the principle of he, whether or not anyone traveling it would have used that word. Its intellectual productivity was a function of the genuine differences it brought into contact. Differences of language, religion, mathematical tradition, artistic convention, philosophical framework, and basic assumption about how knowledge is acquired and what it is for. When these differences met in the caravansers of Central Asia and the markets of Samarkand and the translation houses of Toledo and the court of Kublai Khan, what emerged was not the victory of one tradition over another, but something that none of the participants had possessed before the encounter. It was he, in its most historically consequential form. We have traced the big currents of this exchange. Buddhism traveling east, Greek philosophy traveling west through Arabic intermediaries, mathematics emerging from the synthesis of Indian, Greek, and Persian traditions, religious ideas from Zoroastrianism influencing the development of Judaism and Christianity, the scientific revolution drawing on Islamic astronomical data and optical theory. But some of the most interesting Silk Road idea transmissions are smaller, stranger, and more personal. Stories of individual encounters that capture the texture of the road in ways that the grand intellectual narratives cannot. Consider the case of al-Biruni, born in 973 AD in Khwarazm, modern-day Uzbekistan, at the heart of the Silk Road's Central Asian network, who traveled with Mahmud of Ghazna's armies into India in the early 11th century and spent 17 years studying Indian civilization with a systematic thoroughness that no previous Islamic scholar had attempted. His Kitab fi Tahqiq Malay Hind, usually translated as India, is one of the most remarkable works of comparative cultural analysis produced anywhere in the medieval world.
Al-Biruni learned Sanskrit in order to read Indian philosophical and scientific texts in the original. He studied Hindu philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, geography, and religion with the specific attention of someone who understood that the value of foreign knowledge depended on understanding it on its own terms before evaluating it against your own. He identified where Indian and Greek astronomical traditions agreed and where they diverged, and explained the divergences rather than simply declaring one tradition correct and the other wrong. He noted Indian mathematical techniques that were superior to anything in the Islamic tradition, including specific computational methods for handling large numbers. Al-Biruni's approach, rigorous, comparative, genuinely open to the possibility that the foreign tradition contained things worth learning, was itself a product of the Silk Road intellectual environment. He was operating within the tradition of synthesis that the House of Wisdom had established, extending it into a new cultural domain with a thoroughness that his predecessors had not managed. His India entered Islamic scholarship and eventually, through Latin translations, reached European scholars who had no other reliable source of systematic information about Indian civilization. The European understanding of India that informed the Portuguese navigators who were planning the sea route to Asia in the 15th century was substantially shaped, at several removes, by a Silk Road scholar from Uzbekistan who had learned Sanskrit 1,000 years earlier. The transmission of chess from India to Persia to the Arab world to medieval Europe is another small but revealing Silk Road story. Chess originated in India as chaturanga, a game representing the 4 divisions of the Indian military: elephants, chariots, cavalry, and infantry. It traveled to Persia in the 6th century, where it was transformed into chatrang and then shatranj, the Persian version of the game whose pieces and rules shaped the Arabic version. The Arabic version traveled west with Islamic expansion into Spain, where it was encountered by medieval European players who adapted it further. The counselor piece became the queen, the elephant became the bishop, the chariot became the rook, the cavalry remained the knight, creating the European chess of the medieval period that is essentially the game played today. Along the way, the game carried with it ideas about military strategy, about the relationship between different social roles, about the nature of the contest between minds that crosses cultural boundaries with the specific ease of a game that can be played without shared language. The Silk Road's transmission of artistic ideas was equally rich and equally difficult to fully map. The pointed arch, that defining feature of Gothic cathedral architecture that gives it its characteristic aspiring verticality, has a history that runs from the Islamic architectural tradition, where pointed arches had been used for centuries in mosque and palace construction for both structural and aesthetic reasons through the Crusader castles and Norman Arab buildings of Sicily and southern Italy, into the architectural vocabulary of 12th century northern France where Gothic architecture developed. The connection is not a simple line of direct influence. The pointed arch was possibly independently developed in Europe, but the timing and the geography strongly suggest that European builders were aware of the Islamic tradition and drew on it. The great cathedrals of Europe, those monuments of Christian faith that rose over European cities from the 12th century onward, were built at least partly from architectural knowledge that traveled the same routes as algebra and pepper. The city of Dunhuang, sitting at the point where the northern and southern Silk Road routes converged after circling the Taklamakan Desert, serves as a physical archive of the road's artistic and intellectual exchange in its most concentrated form. The cave temples of the Mogao complex, decorated over a period of 1,000 years beginning in the 4th century, contain murals that show the progression of artistic influence along the routes in a form that can be read almost like a documentary record. Early murals show Indian artistic conventions, the treatment of the human figure, the palette, the iconographic program, adapted by Central Asian workshops into something new. Later murals show the integration of Persian compositional elements, symmetrical arrangements, specific decorative motifs, a particular approach to the representation of fabric and ornament, into what has become a distinctively Dunhuang style that is neither Indian nor Persian nor Chinese, but a synthesis that could only have been produced at exactly that intersection of all three. The latest murals, from the Tang Dynasty period, show a fully developed artistic vocabulary of extraordinary sophistication that incorporates elements from at least 5 different regional traditions so seamlessly that identifying their separate origins requires specialist training. The music represented in those murals, the 40-plus different musical instruments that appear in the cave paintings, representing traditions from Central Asia, India, Persia, and China, suggests that the same synthesis was happening in sound as in image. Historians still argue whether the specific musical modes used in Tang Dynasty court music were primarily of Central Asian origin, as some scholars maintain, or whether they represented an independent Chinese development that happened to share certain features with Central Asian modal systems, as others contend. The argument is probably unresolvable because the reality was genuinely synthetic from very early in the tradition's development. The Chinese court had been absorbing Central Asian musical influences since the Han Dynasty, and by the Tang period, it was no longer meaningful to ask which elements were originally foreign because they had been part of Chinese music for so long that they were simply Chinese. Music. This is how cultural exchange ultimately works on a long enough timeline. The ideas that travel along roads like the Silk Road do not maintain their foreign identity forever. They become native to wherever they settle. The zero that India gave to the Islamic world became the zero of Arabic mathematics, which became the zero of European arithmetic, which became the zero that sits in the middle of every digital system on Earth. Nobody who uses it today thinks of it as Indian or Arabic or Islamic. It is simply the zero, the nothing that makes counting possible, the absence that holds the place for everything. It traveled very far to become so thoroughly at home. There is a garden in the city of Granada, in the southern Spanish region of Andalusia, where water flows through channels cut into the stone floors of pavilions, whose ceilings are covered in stucco decorations of such geometric intricacy that a modern mathematician once spent 3 days documenting all the different symmetry groups represented in a single room. The garden is part of the Alhambra Palace complex, built by the Nasrid Sultans of Granada in the 13th and 14th centuries, and it is one of the most beautiful buildings on Earth by any reasonable standard of measurement.
It is also an object lesson in how completely the Silk Road's intellectual and artistic legacy penetrated the civilization that eventually displaced it, because the mathematical knowledge embedded in those stucco ceilings, the understanding of symmetry, of geometric transformation, of the infinite elaboration of pattern from a finite set of generating rules, was developed in the Islamic mathematical tradition that traveled the Silk Road from Baghdad, and the building that contains it was constructed in the last Islamic kingdom of Spain that would, within 2 centuries of the Alhambra's completion, be sending ships across the Atlantic in search of the Asian wealth that the Silk Road had been delivering overland. The Alhambra is a fitting place to pause in this story because it represents a kind of culmination, the most refined physical expression of the intellectual and artistic synthesis that the Silk Road had been building across 15 centuries, constructed at the western extremity of the road's influence in the last moment before the maritime routes that would eventually displace the overland trade became dominant. Standing in its courts, surrounded by the sound of water and the smell of orange blossom, you are simultaneously at the end of one story and the beginning of another. At the place where the medieval world of Silk Road exchange opened, through the specific circumstances of Iberian history, into the early modern world of oceanic trade and European expansion. The scholars who worked in the libraries of Islamic Spain during the centuries before the Reconquista, the gradual Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula that was completed with the fall of Granada in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west, were engaged in exactly the kind of multi-civilizational synthesis that the Silk Road had always produced at its most productive nodes. The philosopher Averroes, the physician Maimonides, who was both a great Jewish thinker and a student of the Islamic philosophical tradition, the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, whose work on the nature of divine love and the unity of being influenced later European mystical traditions. All were products of an Andalusian culture that had been synthesizing Islamic, Jewish, and Christian intellectual traditions for centuries. This synthesis was not comfortable or without conflict. The history of Islamic Spain included periods of tolerance and periods of persecution in both directions. But it was real, and its intellectual output was extraordinary. Maimonides deserves particular attention because his trajectory illustrates how completely the Silk Road's intellectual network transcended the religious boundaries that are usually emphasized in historical narratives. Born in Cordoba in 1135, he was a rabbi and physician who wrote his major philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed. In Judeo-Arabic, a form of Arabic written in Hebrew script that was the standard intellectual language of the Jewish communities of Islamic Spain. The Guide for the Perplexed was an attempt to reconcile the Aristotelian philosophy transmitted through Islamic scholarship with the Jewish theological tradition, the same project that Aquinas was simultaneously pursuing for Christianity and that Islamic philosophers like Averroes had been pursuing for Islam. All 3 thinkers were working with the same materials. Greek philosophy is transmitted through Baghdad and producing slightly different syntheses shaped by the specific requirements of their respective theological traditions. The Guide for the Perplexed was translated from Judeo-Arabic into Hebrew and then into Latin in the 13th century, and in its Latin form it became one of the texts that shaped the development of Christian scholastic theology. Aquinas cited Maimonides, whom he called Rabbi Moses, more than any other non-Christian philosopher. The irony is layered to the point of being almost dizzying. A Jewish philosopher writing in Arabic in Islamic Spain produced a synthesis of Greek and Jewish thought that influenced the development of Christian theology. And this chain of transmission was possible only because the Islamic scholarly tradition of Baghdad had assembled and transmitted the Greek texts that all 3 traditions were working with. Remove any link in that chain. Remove the Baghdad translation movement, or the Toledo translators, or the specific cosmopolitanism of Andalusian culture. And Aquinas' Summa Theologica is a different book, possibly a lesser one. The mystical traditions that traveled the Silk Road deserve their own moment of attention because they represent a dimension of the road's intellectual legacy that is distinct from the more formally systematic transmissions we have been tracing. Sufism. The mystical tradition within Islam that emphasizes the direct personal experience of the divine, the annihilation of the self in the presence of God, and the cultivation of spiritual states through specific practices of prayer, music, movement, and meditation. Absorbed significant elements from the Buddhist and Zoroastrian mystical traditions it encountered along the Silk Road, while also drawing on Greek philosophical concepts of the soul's return to its divine source that had entered Islamic thought through the Neoplatonic texts translated in Baghdad, the great Sufi poets, Rumi, Hafez, Omar Khayyam, Ibn Arabi. produced works of spiritual literature that synthesized Persian, Arabic, Greek, and Central Asian elements into something that transcended any of its sources. Rumi, born in Balkh in 1207, a city in what is now Afghanistan, at the heart of the Silk Road's Central Asian network, and later settled in Konya in Anatolia, was himself a Silk Road figure in the most literal sense. A person who had moved along the routes from east to west in a journey shaped by the Mongol disruptions of the 13th century, and whose work synthesized the Persian literary tradition, Islamic theological training, and the mystical encounter with his teacher Shams of Tabriz into a poetry of extraordinary emotional directness and philosophical depth. His Masnavi, sometimes called the Persian Quran by Persian speakers, is one of the greatest works of world literature, and it is a Silk Road text in its bones, a synthesis of story, philosophy, and mystical experience that draws on traditions from across the breadth of the Eurasian continent. Rumi's poetry has been the best-selling poetry in the United States for several decades, a fact that would presumably astonish him, though perhaps less than you might expect, given how thoroughly he understood the universality of the human experiences he was writing about. The fact that a 13th century Persian language mystical poet from a city in Afghanistan is the most widely read poet in 21st century America is, among other things, a reminder that the Silk Road's intellectual transmission did not stop when the road itself declined. The ideas it set in motion continued to travel, continued to transform, continued to find new audiences in new places who recognized in them something that their own traditions had not adequately expressed. The legacy of the Silk Road in Western thought is not a completed historical chapter. It is an ongoing process of encounter and absorption and synthesis that has never entirely stopped. The Western philosophical tradition that was shaped by the Arabic transmission of Greek philosophy continues to be reshaped by encounter with the traditions that the Silk Road connected. The mathematics that was assembled from Indian, Persian, and Greek elements in Baghdad continues to evolve through the work of mathematicians working in every cultural tradition on Earth. The religious and mystical traditions that traveled the road continue to influence each other in ways that their original practitioners would not have anticipated. The food, the music, the art, the architecture, all continue to absorb and transform the influences that the road set in motion. The road closed, in its formal overland form, when the Ottoman Empire redirected the commercial flows of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 15th century, and European maritime expansion created new channels for the goods and ideas that the road had previously carried. But closure of the physical route did not close the intellectual channels it had opened. Those channels simply found new forms. The printing press, the Atlantic trade, the scholarly networks of the Republic of Letters that connected European intellectuals across national boundaries in the 16th and 17th centuries, and continued to carry the ideas that the road had set moving. The fire at the caravanserai in the Tarim Basin is still burning, in a sense. The conversation between the Sogdian merchant and the Buddhist monk has never entirely ended. It has simply moved, as all conversations eventually do, from the place where it started to wherever the people who were shaped by it happen to be. The lights are low. The night has settled around whatever room you are in whatever city or town or quiet rural place you have found yourself in tonight. If you have left me a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there, and I genuinely hope you have, because those small dispatches from around the world are among the things I treasure most about making these videos, then right now, as you are drifting towards sleep, this story is reaching into dozens of different time zones simultaneously, touching people in morning kitchens and late night, bedrooms and afternoon rest periods on the other side of the planet. That distribution of a single conversation across multiple times and places is itself a small echo of what the Silk Road did. It is what all roads do when they carry ideas rather than only goods. We began this evening with a Sogdian merchant and a Buddhist monk sharing a fire in the Tarim Basin around the year 200 AD, and we ended here, with you, in whatever century has found you listening to this story, in whatever form it has reached you. Between that fire and this moment lies the full arc of what we have been tracing. The 1500 years during which the most consequential trade route in human history carried not just silk and tea and spices, but the intellectual inheritance of multiple civilizations simultaneously, building through the friction and productivity of encounter, something that none of its contributing traditions could have produced alone. Let us briefly remember where we have been, because the sheer scope of the journey deserves a moment of quiet acknowledgement. We started with Alexander the Great's army spreading Greek philosophy across Central Asia, creating the intellectual substrate that would allow ideas to travel the road in both directions for the next 15 centuries. We followed Buddhism from its Indian origins along the oasis routes of the Tarim Basin into China, watching it transform the inner life of an entire civilization and produce, through its encounter with Chinese Taoism and Confucianism, entirely new philosophical and spiritual traditions that no single source could have generated. We trace the Zoroastrian dualism that traveled from ancient Iran into the religious vocabulary of Judaism and Christianity, shaping the very architecture of how Western civilization thinks about good and evil, light and darkness, the moral structure of the universe. We watched Manichaeism carry that dualist tradition along the road in both directions, leaving its mark in the mind of Augustine of Hippo, and through him in the development of Christian theology for the next 15 centuries. We stood in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad and watched the most ambitious act of intellectual synthesis in the ancient world, the assembly of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian knowledge into the Arabic scholarly tradition that produced algebra, the algorithm, the astronomical tables that made the scientific revolution possible, and the medical encyclopedia that European physicians used for 500 years. We followed that synthesis west through the Toledo translation movement into the European university system, where it became the intellectual foundation of scholastic theology, Renaissance philosophy, and the scientific revolution. We noted, with appropriate appreciation for the historical comedy of it, that the paper on which all of this was written was itself a Chinese invention that had traveled to Baghdad as a consequence of a military defeat at the Battle of Talas, and that the printing press that eventually disseminated these ideas through European society was running on material transmitted by the same road that had carried every other idea in the story. We traveled east with Marco Polo under the protection of the Pax Mongolica and discovered that the specific geographical curiosity his account generated in European readers eventually produced, through a chain of consequences that nobody planned, the European encounter with the Americas, which was itself a consequence of wanting to find a sea route to the Asian wealth that the Silk Road had been delivering. Overland. We lingered in the gardens of the Alhambra and in the libraries of Islamic Spain, where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars were simultaneously working with the same Greek texts transmitted through the same Arabic channels, producing syntheses of extraordinary richness that crossed every boundary that their respective traditions nominally maintained. We followed the Sufi poets, Rumi most of all, from the Central Asian cities of the Silk Road into a world of mystical literature that is still finding new readers in places that Rumi could not have imagined. And in all of this, the constant was the road itself, not as a physical thing, because the physical road was always shifting, its specific routes changing with the seasons and the political conditions and the availability of water, but as a principle. The principle that the encounter of genuine difference, honestly engaged, produces knowledge that no single tradition could generate in isolation. The principle that ideas are not diminished by traveling, that Greek philosophy did not become less Greek by being translated into Arabic and then into Latin, but became more useful, more widely applicable, more generative of new questions. The principle that the most creative moments in intellectual history are almost always moments of contact and synthesis, rather than moments of isolated genius. This principle is, in the deepest sense, what the Silk Road was. It was not a supply chain for luxury goods, though it was that too. It was not a missionary highway for expanding religions, though it was that as well. It was a demonstration, repeated in thousands of individual human encounters over 15 centuries, that the world is more interesting and more productive when its different ways of knowing are in conversation with each other than when they are sealed off from each other, in the mutual incomprehension that feels like safety but is actually impoverishment.
You probably will not survive the existential vertigo of fully contemplating how deeply the ideas of cultures you have never studied have shaped the intellectual world you inhabit. The Indian mathematician zero sitting in the center of your telephone number, the Zoroastrian dualism embedded in the moral vocabulary of every story you have ever been told about good and evil, the Islamic optical theory, in the perspective geometry of every painting you have ever admired, the Buddhist concept of impermanence lurking in the background of almost every serious Western philosophical reflection on the nature of time and change. These inheritances are not decorative additions to a tradition that would have reached the same conclusions independently. They are structural. The Western intellectual tradition, as it actually exists and has actually developed, is made of them.
The word algorithm, that term we use constantly to describe the automated procedures that run our digital world, the procedures that decide what news you see and what music you are offered and which roads your navigation app suggests, is the name of a 9th century Islamic mathematician from Uzbekistan, filtered through Latin transliteration. Every time a computer executes an algorithm, it is, in the most etymologically precise sense possible, doing something named after a Silk Road scholar. The road never closed. It just changed form. The silkworm is still spinning, as we noted at the end of our silk story. The tea is still being picked, as we noted at the end of our tea story. And the conversation that the Silk Road made possible, between civilizations, between traditions, between ways of understanding what it means to be human and what it means to know something, is still happening in universities and translation bureaus and research centers, and the casual cross-cultural exchanges of a connected world in forms that the Sogdian merchant and the Buddhist monk, at that, Tarim Basin Fire could not have imagined and would probably have recognized immediately. That is what roads do when they carry ideas. They keep going. They carry the ideas further than their builders intended, further than the travelers expected, further than the merchants carrying their silk and their tea and their spices needed them to go. They carry the ideas until the ideas become so thoroughly part of the intellectual landscape that their origin on a specific road, in a specific encounter, in a specific exchange between two specific people at a fire on the edge of a desert is no longer visible. But it is still there. It is always still there. If tonight's journey gave you something, some warmth in the telling, some wonder at the connections, some of that specific settled feeling that comes when a long story finds its way to an ending that honors everything it has covered, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these journeys going. And drop me that comment, where you are, what time it is, what the night sounds like where you are. Because every single one of those notes is itself a small act of the kind of connection that the Silk Road spent 15 centuries making possible. Sleep well. The road is still going, and there are more journeys ahead whenever you are ready. Good night.